And so already back then, the connection uh, to a heathen world must have been very feeble from the evidence that we have. So that maybe there were, a ton of small, wooden inscriptions that we don't have anymore. But from the evidence that we have thousands of runic monuments which were overtly Christian. That's a pretty clear indication.
Yeah, and it just strikes me as like, even if you think, and I don't know that any medieval missionaries would think this way, like, well, we have the better alphabet that we're bringing into you. It's like, well, still, if there's already an alphabet on the ground that people know, just let them. If, the Roman alphabet was used by pagans first too, right? Um,
Yeah, yeah.
so So, folks, our guest today, Dr. Alessandro Palumbo, is, as I said in the announcement on Patreon, and of the University of Oslo, and we met in Oslo just this summer at the National Library in June, and got to talking about maybe having you on to talk about a few topics, and one that I was particularly interested in was, or to start with at least, was talking about some Runic Latin, because I think people really do have a really undercharacterized sense of just how much there is.
Mm.
Right. So could you maybe give us a little bit of a intro to this subject? You are co-host, so you do have the ability to share screen if there's anything you'd like to share in terms of pictures or anything like that.
Yeah, yeah. Yes, and I think you're absolutely right. I mean, when people hear Runic and Latin in the same in the same sentence, I mean, most people don't know that Latin was written in runes in the Middle Ages in Scandinavia, and I think that's well, I guess a couple of reasons why this is maybe a topic that is lesser known than other runic topics, rune stones, Viking Age. That's partly because the runic tradition from the Scandinavian Middle Ages is generally less known than the Viking Age one.
Mm.
Many people don't know that Scandinavians kept on carving runes for a few hundred centuries after the Viking Age.
Sure.
But I think it's also because maybe a lot of people kind of automatically connect runes with some sort of runic language or with a language that is Scandinavian. And conversely, people may link the Latin language automatically to the Roman alphabet, to the Latin alphabet, right? So
Mm.
kind of the combinations of Latin written in runes, it seems like a weird phenomenon. But so runic Latin is basically what it sounds like. So it is Latin carved in runes, and it kind of constitutes a minority of the total medieval Scandinavian runic corpus. So let's say we have roughly 1,400 runic inscriptions from medieval Norway, 400 from Denmark, and right 600-700 from Sweden. And in total, there are around, I think, 350-400 runic inscriptions that are either totally carved in Latin or contain parts in Latin. And then, of course, it depends on how you count and what you count as Latin.
Sure. Like, for example, I suspect part of what you might mean with that is acronyms that reflect Latin. Like,
Yes. Yeah. So, for example, what do you do with when you have a runic text which is in the vernacular, let's say Old Swedish, and then it only ends in amen.
Uh-huh.
Is that's a Latin word,
I see what you mean. I see what you
okay?
mean.
But it doesn't necessarily mean that. I mean, there was no vernacular, there was no Scandinavian equivalent to that word. So should it count as Latin? And then names can be in a sort of Latin form, for example. Should those inscriptions that only have names in some sort of Latinized form count as Runic Latin inscriptions? And then you have well, quite a few actually inscriptions that may contain parts in Latin, but other these parts are so corrupt that we're not sure. They may look like there may be parts that sound like Latin. And it can be that we cannot interpret them for some reason. They may be damaged, and so on and so forth. But it's also part of the problem is that some people just didn't know how to write. They just didn't know Latin, but they tried anyway
Mhm.
for various reasons. So you would have, some sort of words that sound like Latin, like ending in us and and all
Sure.
these kind of Latin sounding sequences, but they are not really Latin. So it's pseudo
Sure.
Latin in a way.
And is the majority of inscribed Runic Latin formulaic? I mean, is it mostly things that people are hearing often in church or in legal context, something like that?
Mhm. Yeah, so most of the Latin we find carved in runes is formulaic, absolutely, and it's a gen. I mean, the most common examples are prayers, the Our Father or the Hail Mary, for example, in various forms. You don't always find like the whole Hail Mary prayer, for example. Most of the times you find an abbreviated form, maybe the beginning, or maybe just the title, Ave Maria,
Hmm.
or Pater Noster. But then you find also some more, still formulaic, but more elaborate ones. So quotes from biblical passages or um, references to quotes from psalms or hymns, for example. We have some examples of Latin poetry as well, and then there are some references in Latin to Christian legends of, taken from different Christian religious texts.
Hmm.
So there is a lot of variation, but basically formulaic. So you don't have, I don't think there is or if there is an example of an original Latin text, they're really few.
Hmm. I was thinking about that a little bit because another person that I met with when I was in Oslo in June was Christo Silner,
Right.
and she and I were looking at all these little folded lead, uh, I suppose you would say amulets, right?
Yeah.
These little folded scrolls, and it was funny because the first I asked if I could try to read one, or she said I challenge you to read one or something, and I said okay, and so we put it under the microscope, and when I realized it was Latin, I was kind of surprised that, oh, this is in Latin. She said, actually, that shouldn't surprise you. It's most of these. Um, and are those also typically formulaic in content?
Yes, but they sometimes so that's definitely true. A lot of runic inscriptions in Latin are found in amulets. There are many lead amulets that can either be rolled onto themselves or kind of folded, and they contain formulaic parts, but they are not necessarily kind of coherent quotes from
Right.
a given text. So they may be like a kind of a jigsaw puzzle of different kind of powerful words or powerful Christian formulas, for
Mm-hmm.
example, names.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I understand the part of the challenge of reading an amulet because they're not they're not that easy to read.
No, well, and with them all folded, you really only get to
Oh
see
yeah, no, that's impossible. Yeah.
a
Mm.
portion of it. But yeah, it strikes me, I wonder. do you think that part of this is a sense that writing itself is a prestigious act and Latin is a more prestigious language?
Hmm.
Is that part of, like, what is the why for all of this material being in Latin?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And I think a lot of it boils down to kind of what kind of value, what kind of
Mhm.
societal value was attached to Latin in the Middle Ages, which was very high. Obviously, it was I mean, the language of the church, of the administration as well, in general, of several powerful cultural and religious institutions. And so I do think that, for example, when Latin was used in amulets, in with the religious context, it was well, it was also almost a must to use Latin because it was perceived as um, well in those contexts which we could define as performative. So you were carving runes to achieve something,
Mhm.
right? To have a to heal somebody or to help somebody in need. Then using Latin, which was the language of the liturgy and had that power kind of imbued into it. I think it's definitely the one of the most one of the strongest reasons as to why use Latin, even as I said before, even when people really didn't master Latin that well or at all for that matter. And that's also part of the difficulty when reading and trying to interpret these inscriptions in Latin is that you don't really know what to expect. Because you could guess that, okay, this person was maybe copying a Latin text without knowing what it actually said. And
Mhm.
so you kind of have to reconstruct from the spelling that they used, okay, what could the original text have been? But that's one reason, kind of the link to religion. Um, Another reason could be that it's still connected to the status that was given to Latin in the Middle Ages. So, for example, something that I kind of have studied more intensively in the past couple of years or so are texts that actually mix both the vernacular and Latin, and often also both runes and Latin letters. So you can see that when they use both runes, say in the vernacular, and Roman letters in the Latin language, they kind of address different audiences, and they kind of want to convey um, different values or different cultural spheres that they wanted to be attached to or as be seen as attached to. Um, so another example would be that Latin sometimes was used in scriber signatures.
Hmm.
So what one could imagine that there you don't have like this religious link very very strong, right? So someone would carve an inscription in say in Old Swedish, for example, and he would end it with uh, Harald me fekit, Harald made me, or another name, for example. So probably maybe in a sense in those cases people were trying to exploit kind of maybe the economic capital that they seem to have had by kind of know how to carve something in Latin, for example.
Mhm. And
Mm.
maybe that seems more prestigious than Harold or Gerðinmek. Uh, just because it's like, well, anybody can say that. It's like, but I know how to say it the fancy way. Um, there was a question here in the comments, and folks, please feel free to drop your questions, remarks in the comments. Rambeck says, when you say formulaic, does that mean the Latin inscriptions are almost always religious?
Um, so most of them have a religious content in one way or another. It could be other prayers, as I said before, but or kind of well, quotes from biblical passages, so also religious. So yeah, I guess most of the runic inscriptions that contain Latin, the parts in Latin, are have some sort of religious link, apart from maybe these signatures that I was talking about before.
But do you have any examples of inscriptions you
Yeah.
can show us perhaps on the screen there? It'd be interesting to
Yes.
take a look at some of that.
So maybe let's
You,
see, since you were talking about amulets before, maybe you can start by showing one.
one thing I've been a little bit curious about is just how consistent the runic orthography of Latin is in these inscriptions, right? I mean, do people agree, as it were, about how Latin is spelled in runes? You know, that's is that a pretty consistent one-to-one correspondence that they settle on between Roman and runic letters, or is there some chaos there?
So there is a lot of variation, and it kind of depends on several factors. One of these factors is that people knew Latin to different extents
Hmm.
and knew how to write in general to different degrees, right? So and then there was no, I guess written Latin was more standardized than the written vernacular, but still you had variation even in the written form.
Hmm.
And this variation kind of is amplified in the runic alphabet, because you have, well, first of all you have, well, fewer runes than Latin letters.
Hmm.
So there are some letters that do not have a kind of a natural counterpart in the runic alphabet. So what do you do with those? And people, uh, try to come up with different sorts of solutions.
So like
Um,
Q,
for example, yeah,
like do you write that as
or
so,
X.
right, sure.
X. So
So
X, you have like a bunch of different solutions. Let me see if I can share my screen.
you should be able to because you're co-host. Yep, looks like it. You
Yeah,
got it going.
right. So so for example, just
All right, although
um
right now I just see blank.
yeah. So I mean, for example, me for the I was just wanted to try on that.
Oh, cool.
So kind of for the X. Unfortunately, I just have my mouse to
No, this works.
crawl with. So sometimes they would use, a combination of runes like K and an S, for
Hmm.
example. So you would have oh, this is terrible. Sorry, K and S.
I don't know. It looks kind of runic to me.
Um, and or G and S, and then of course, I mean, S runes could look a little bit differently in the different Scandinavian countries, but then some people just were more innovative and ingenious, and they made up their own kind of new runes.
Hmm.
And so some people, for example, use the H rune. Well, some people actually use the H rune period, because we think because it looks like an X,
Sure.
and so it kind of substituted the letter X. But some people add the dots here
Hmm.
to kind of distinguish it from the rune H, right?
Hmm. That's neat.
Isn't
And
it?
it's,
No, they were ingenious. I mean, that's how it works when you don't have to go to school and learn some spelling norms, and then you can make up your own.
right. Well,
And some other people kind of took the S rune and kind of um, did this variation and used this as an X rune, for example. So yeah, people were pretty ingenious.
and what's interesting to me is that you look at these three possibilities that you've laid out there, and the one furthest left looks to me like someone who's aware of spoken Latin, someone who's heard it and thinks, well, how do I
Mm.
represent
Mm.
that in just sound by sound? And but
Mm.
then the two on the right are someone who's aware of Latin as a written language and thinks of X as a
Yes.
conceptually as one, grapheme rather than not thinking about the phonemes. And so you've got potentially two different ways that someone is encountering Latin, and that's reflected in the two different ways that it's being rendered in runic writing.
That's exactly right. And that is actually also kind of partly some of the cues that we try and use to um, infer what kind of Latin knowledge people had.
Mm-hmm.
So, or of the written language at all, because I mean, as you pointed out, I mean, someone that carves kind of this with this, they're making up a new written character, right? A new rune that corresponds because in their mind they probably know what Latin X looks like, and that it's one letter and it's not a combination of two sounds like k and s,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so they have like kind of the written image, the image of the written word in their mind probably. Whereas someone who does like this, who finds this kind of solution with a digraph, so two different runes, probably they would just, you know, say the sound or the word where, you know, rex, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And then they would go and, you know, spell them out. Okay, R, you know, E, and then K and S. Makes sense. Which is basically the way most runic writing works. It's basically, it's almost to a very high degree, at least, so-called orthophonic, so kind of reproducing the pronunciation. This is true in inscriptions in the vernacular already in the Viking Age. That's why we try and use and kind of interpret the spelling in Viking Age runic inscriptions, for example, to say something about the spoken language. That's because most runologists, or many of us at least, think that there is a high degree of correspondence between how they wrote and how they talked.
Mm-hmm.
Although, I mean, there's all sorts of complications, of course. I mean, I'm simplifying. But so this is really interesting because most of the Latin, I mean, there are some examples of inscriptions where you really find a very good one-to-one correspondence between the runes used and the Latin letters used. And in other inscriptions, it's just orthophonic, so they just reproduce the local pronunciation of Latin. And that's also how we can, for example, deduce how Latin in the Scandinavian regions, in the Scandinavian areas, was spoken compared to Latin in other places in Europe. But this is tricky. Let me show you one example that I because so if you use kind of this sign to say, okay, if they use like an orthophonic spelling, a spelling that reproduces the local pronunciation, their own pronunciation, that means that they probably are writing down the Latin that they heard. They probably learn Latin by ear, maybe church, you know, and everybody can hear Pater Noster in church and try and spell it out with runes. But in some cases, the general level of literacy, so proficiency in the written language, is so high that you kind of that it's difficult to say because there is such a high kind of proficiency in the written language that another possibility is that they had their own standard. They just had the Runic Latin way of spelling things. So it doesn't, the fact that, you know, the way they spelled Latin in runes doesn't correspond 100% to what the spelling we may find in a Latin manuscript.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean that they were worse in
Sure.
Latin.
Sure.
So one example is this one. This is a grave slab. This is a recumbent monument, so it was just, you know, lifted up, but it's actually a grave slab, so it's flat, which is one of the main differences in, by the way, in kind of runic monuments between the Viking Age, you know, erected rune stones, and then the Middle Ages, where you have kind of recumbent monuments, runic monuments. And so you can see here that it's a pretty long text. It kind of starts at the top with Roman letters, as you can see over there. Hic jacet Turgillus, here lies Turgillus. And then it kind of continues in runes and in Old Swedish. So, okay, who was this Turgillus? Oh, he was the son of Meister Gudmund Gås. And then, by the way, don't go anywhere. So there is this kind of injunction to the reader, this ask, do not go from here. Stay and look at this monument and read your prayers for the soul of Thorgils. Which would be kind of this part. If you can see, I mean, you can see the cursor, right?
Yep, I can.
You can see, yeah. See if you can see here. I mean, this part is kind of framed by crosses, but otherwise there's nothing that divides the Latin and in Latin letters and then the vernacular in runes. It just continues, grammatically speaking. So here lies Turgillus, the son of. And then in the end, I mean, you can see that there is a long part here in runes on these two, on the second long side and the short side here. And that's the Hail Mary prayer in runes, right? And right here is you have another switch of language, but in the same alphabet. So it's
so interesting too, looking at some of the spellings here. I mean, so what you've transcribed as an ad benedictus, I suppose is Latin odd, right? AD.
It would be the so let me I don't know, maybe all your listeners here are very good in Latin, but I'm not. So this would be
interesting.
So this would be kind of the normalized part and then the translation. And as you noticed, so you have the the conjunction et, which is reproduced with a, so with an ash rune, probably reproducing kind of the more open pronunciation compared to, say, long a, for example. And then instead of the t at the end, you have this weakened sound represented by the sound at the end. And this is actually this is pretty interesting because it's a common way of spelling final T in Latin when written in runes, but it's also a phenomenon that you see in some other, continental Latin sources where you have this weakening of T in final position, or sometimes even in medial position, so in the middle of the word. And so you would say, yes, so this is definitely a spelling that reproduces the pronunciation of Latin. Does it mean that the guy didn't know his Latin? I don't know, because the rest, it's basically perfect. And he also you cannot even say that he tries to reproduce the Latin norm, because he also uses some pretty neat and interesting innovations within the runic alphabet. So, for example, this N here that I have transliterated as a capital N, it's not a mistake. That's just a very special kind of N rune, which is dotted. So it has a little dot at the end of the branch, the diagonal stroke, and it's very few carvers that use this N rune, and it's only used for a long N or for an N between before the T or a D. So this person had a really, he was very proficient in the runic writing, and his Latin is otherwise, without mistakes. Whereas in other runic Latin texts, you can see all sorts of corruptions and all sorts of mistakes, together with these spellings that reproduce the pronunciation of Latin. So, and an interesting thing is that Of course, we don't know if the same guy carved both the runes and the Roman alphabet part here.
Mhm.
But at least if it was two people, assuming that they had worked together, the rune carver had access to a proper, let's say, Latin norm,
Mhm.
because the person, for example, if you compare the word jacket, right, or jacet um, in the medieval pronunciation of Latin, so lies, you can see that here he uses the C, the same letter, for both the sounds, so jacet, and for the sound k in hic,
Oh, I understand
hic,
the point.
jacet, right? But in the runic part, they actually use two different runes. So these two sounds are differentiated. Um, for example, I think I may even have right. So the s or the ts sound in grazia or grazia
Mhm.
is spelled with this rune, which we transliterate with a C, and it looks like this. But then, for example, in tecum, they use the K rune. And so they kind of use this differentiation that is not used in the Roman alphabet part. And if this was the same person, it means that he uses two different standards when using two different scripts. It doesn't mean that he didn't know Latin.
Right, it's
Um,
remarkably conscious. Uh,
yeah, isn't it? Yes. Mm.
I mean, and in fact, it's kind of bold, right? Because I mean, you think of so often, I think we think of ancient and medieval writers as being kind of just slaves to tradition, but this is someone who's thinking about how to represent this more like, well, like actually thinking about how a different orthography would reflect this language and not just trying to copy one to one. Um,
Mm. Yeah. Mm.
I mean,
And
it's
this is one
impressive.
of the yeah, I love this this inscription is one of my favorite ones. Um, On the other hand, you have other, for example, in some amulets which bear like remarkably long Latin texts. Some of these amulets have, several lines carved on both sides, for example. And there you can see that kind of the norm, the Latin norm, let's say, is more closely followed.
Mm.
And you have people kind of, as we said before, you have carvers or inscribers that try to come up with direct counterparts, runic counterparts to Latin letters that were lacking in the runic alphabet. And so they have a totally different approach to
Mm.
reproducing Latin in runes. They have the Latin written norm as a model, and then they try to kind of model their own runic practice onto the Latin one. Whereas this carver here, does his own thing,
Mhm.
basically. Um,
And then the rendering of et as av, I mean, it like that's so interesting because you see as something like what you had alluded to earlier, the development of a Scandinavian norm of Latin in the Middle Ages,
mm,
right? This is, I mean, it looks exactly like changes that are happening to the spoken vernacular too, uh,
mm,
and might reflect sort of normalized pronunciation of Latin at this time. It's hard to say, right? I guess, but
mm.
it's a really interesting little detail.
Yeah, yeah. Unfortunately, I'm not very knowledgeable about Latin written in manuscripts. That's not really my field. But I think, for example, that this detail of the T, final T spelled with a thorn, for example, or an eth, um, which you may think, could occur in Scandinavian manuscripts. I don't think it does that much, at least, from what I've gathered from other sources. So this seems to be kind of a runic standard, in a way.
Which is just fascinating that something like that could develop, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it speaks to uh, a community of people really thinking about and talking about how they're doing this.
Mm. Mm. And of course, there must have been connections to, people who wrote manuscripts
Mhm.
or charters. And
Sure.
so you have this, but it's a huge, question mark. Um, so who were these people? Where did they learn Latin? Because this doesn't mean, that they could write the Ave Maria prayer. It doesn't mean that they were proficient, in Latin in general. I mean, they knew the Latin
Sure.
that they needed to know in order to do their job. But the question is, where did they learn it? Who did they learn it from? In what alphabet did they learn it? Because it's not. I mean, some people must have had a competence in the Roman alphabet as well. So let's say that they learned some Latin through the Roman alphabet and then they transposed it into runes. But it could also be that, this person learned the Latin he needed through other runic sources.
Hmm.
Right? So it doesn't mean that he had to have, you know, a direct connection to a community that wrote in the Latin alphabet, apart from in this particular case that you have Roman letters on the same monument, which is really really fascinating.
Hmm.
Um,
Is that common or otherwise? I mean, I
not
part.
not not that common, no.
Hmm.
But there are a few examples. I mean, I would say around, let's say in total, maybe 100.
Hmm.
And they vary greatly in kind of nature. So you have this here that you have, this little phrase in the Roman alphabet. You have other cases where you only have one letter, for example. I could show you an example of this, for example, here. So these are two bottom parts of drinking vessels, and they have been carved with, well, runes, only runes on the left side, and what looks like a kind of a nicely decorated initial uh, letter B,
Yeah.
and then runes. These are actually from Finland, kind of the two of the four, I think, uh, genuine medieval runic inscriptions we know from Finland. Um, so here you have on the left side you have a Latin inscription. Again, the Ave Maria was really really popular in the
Hmm.
Middle Ages. Probably had a apotropaic function, so a protective function.
Hmm.
This was a either a drinking vessel or a vessel for containing liquids anyway. So maybe to protect what was inside or the drinker. And then on on the right example, you have what looks like a single letter B, and then the runes Wale. And what we have proposed is that the B is an abbreviation for Bene,
Hmm.
and then Wale is just Runic Latin for Vale, so Bene Vale, live well, which was a common salutation phrase also in charters, in documents, legal documents, for example. Um, and then, I mean, so this is kind of the least amount of Latin letters you can have together with runes. In this case, it makes sense. In some other cases, you just have, random Latin letters just, introduced into a runic text.
Hmm.
Sometimes none of it gives any meaning. So,
And I was kind of intrigued by the very first example that we looked at for a while because the character of the Latin letters changes, right? Hic, you have that hic jacet written in something that looks more like the Carolingian hand than a manuscript, or maybe maybe kind of uncial, I guess. But then the name is written in much less. There's fewer serifs. There's just these straight lines. They look more like just sort of quick dashed off capitals.
let me see.
Um, You know what I mean? Like that in itself is kind of funny to me.
Yeah,
The Latin words are written fancy manuscript style. The Latinized Norse name is just like slapdash capitals.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
And it's interesting because it's also, I mean, you can also see in many of these inscriptions, especially the earliest ones in Roman alphabet, especially those, I would say especially those together with runes. So this is an example from the maybe late 13th century or very early 14th century. you can see that the Latin letters are maybe not that pretty. Let's say so. I mean,
Yeah, sure.
this is acceptable, but um but for example,
It's not a
let me
10 out
show
of
you.
10. It's a
Sorry?
it's not a 10 out of 10. Yeah.
No,
If
but
it,
it's just this is a kind of course this is a little bit of speculation, but it could be. I mean, the fact that the epigraphic character of the Roman alphabet, so the kind of the letters don't really have that inscription kind of monumental character.
mhm,
Could be a sign that these some of these carvers were actually more proficient in runes, and then they added the Latin letters part of it, and at least like we are saying before, as sort of status marker
mhm.
of some sort. I mean, just to go back to this example for a second, you can see there here that I mean, this is actually it's actually very little text that is written in the Roman alphabet, but it's at the top. It's framed by big crosses, right?
Mhm.
And it's kind of the most. It's kind of the headline, right?
Yeah, I see what
Kind
you
of the
mean.
most important. But on the other hand, if you can't read these letters, these Roman letters, it doesn't really matter because the name of the person is repeated in runes, and you know who he is. Uh, you have this. You can read the excerpt, the injunction or the ask that the carver makes of the reader just to stay there and look at the inscription. And by the way, I mean it also tells you in which prayer you should be reading, right? The Ave Maria.
Mhm.
And not only that, in case you don't know that much Latin, I have, carved these Latin words exactly the way you should be pronouncing them
Uh-huh.
because it reproduces the pronunciation of the Latin, right? So you can read it and you just have to know the runes. Um,
Yeah, I see what you mean. Well, I mean, it reminds you that the audience for this is local, right?
mm, yes.
Um, they're not thinking about a traveler from the Vatican coming across this and what they're going to think about it.
Most probably not. Not in this little village.
Yeah. But
Um,
that's so interesting too, because I mean it speaks to the local audience for runic inscriptions, however large that is, right?
mm,
There's an audience that is able to read this. Um,
mm.
and that Latin text means something to them, even if they don't necessarily, as you said, their competence in Latin may not be great, but they probably recognize a prayer like this because they hear it every day.
Yeah, yeah. Another example that I really love is this one. So this is a so let me know if I'm derailing from the original topic you wanted to talk about because this
This
is
is great.
actually I'm actually realizing that the only part in Latin it's this one in Latin letters. Um, but it's also quite very interesting because so you have the same text in a Scandinavian vernacular repeated twice, exactly the same, once in runes or here
Mhm,
and then once in Roman letters over here. And right, the reason why I wanted to show you this example was that because we were talking about like the quality of the Latin letters.
mhm.
And here this Haraldus, he's a little bit all over the place. So there is a ton of variation between the letters. Um,
Yeah.
Different kinds of T's and different kinds of A's and so on and so forth. And you can easy or I can easily imagine that he was much more proficient in runes
Hmm.
and that he wanted to add this Roman alphabet part. I mean, probably because the commissioner wanted him to, because the commission wanted to be associated with the cultural sphere, kind of the world of values
Hmm.
that was attached to the Latin written culture, right? And then he chose by himself to carve his own signature, not only in Roman alphabet, but also in Latin. Um, why? I think that's because of what we said before. He wanted to be attached to this kind of international, kind of cosmopolitan almost environment. I mean, at the same time, this is around the 1200s. Around this time, a lot of foreign kind of continental craftsmen must have come to this from the west of Sweden, Västergötland, so the southwest of Sweden. During this period in this area, they built a ton of churches and big cathedral in Skara, for example, and for sure a lot of foreign craftsmen were called in to help out, right? So all of a sudden you have this really international milieu there, and probably he wanted to belong to that milieu or mark that he was part of that international kind of community in a way.
And he probably doesn't realize. I mean, there's such interesting things you try to infer about this guy from looking at this. I mean, the first thing that strikes me is the T in Magister is the weirdest T I've ever seen in my life. But then, like, just looking at Magister spelling the G with an H, because you see in runic writing sometimes there's intervocalic G's written with the H rune. Like,
Precisely.
So what does this reflect about how they're pronouncing Latin, right? Is this Scandinavian Latin in the 1200s? That's so interesting.
Yeah, and this is generally, this was very well spotted, because this is generally a sign that we interpret as actually lower competence in written Latin.
Makes sense.
Because you kind of transpose a runic practice, as I said before, the use of H for intervocalic G, because you have this sound, right? So it's very, very often in the Middle Ages that they represent that as with an H rune. And so he kind of transposed this practice to the Roman alphabet part. And this kind of tells me that he was not extremely proficient in written Latin, but that he tried very hard. Basically. And
and although the Latin letters for the Old Norse text are upside down, I'm looking at that and seeing, some interesting choices there. I can't quite tell what he's done with the Thorn or Ev. But like Bjorn, I guess actually in the runes too is spelled, Beorn, which is interesting. I mean, what exactly is that pronunciation reflect? Is that still a falling diphthong?
I think it's probably Bjorn.
Yeah, that's what I'd expect, but it
Yeah.
almost looks like a really archaic pronunciation, right? Like with a Old English like diphthong or something. But just that decision is interesting.
Yeah, and then in the Roman alphabet as well.
Yeah. I don't know. I think this stuff is great. I've never seen anything like this.
It's pretty unknown. I mean, it's a few monuments that have this kind of mixing of languages and alphabet, but I think they are incredibly fascinating. Especially, I mean, there's so much you can nerd out about.
Yeah.
So
because like what is this guy's mental picture of the Roman alphabet? Because it's very different from mine. Right. Like it seems like a combination of some manuscript hands, some square capitals from different periods. Like I still wonder where this T in Magister comes from, because it's the weirdest looking T I've ever looked at. I don't know, I like it.
yeah, no, you find this T in other descriptions as well, but he has a lot of variation, let's say. And this is really, I mean, this is a really early example of Latin alphabet inscriptions in Sweden. So 1200s, I mean, there are not many inscriptions that are older than this. And so we can imagine that these were kind of the first attempts from a rune carver, by the way, because when I say that he was first and foremost a rune carver, I think I have good arguments for that, because for example, I mean that we have this little detail with the H, for example, but also the formulae that he uses. So in the if you remember in the outer graves lab funerary monuments that we looked at before, inscriber chooses the hic jacet, here lies formula, which is really, really widespread in continental inscriptions, Latin inscriptions, he still uses basically the same formula that, people used in the Viking Age.
Mhm.
So say 100 years before, 150 years before, he still uses the same formula instead of kind of adapting his vocabulary, let's say his sexual repertoire
Yeah.
to the Latin tradition, which other people do, but he doesn't, and that's probably because he's kind of experimenting. This is
Mhm.
the really beginning of this new era of the writing culture in Scandinavia.
This is a fascinating moment in time.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I mean,
Um,
in each one of the three parts of it, it's a fascinating moment in time.
if you go a little bit further in time and kind of move to another um, geographical area, then you find much more professionalized combinations of the two scripts. So this is 14th century Gotland, the island of Gotland,
Mhm.
and you can see that the uh, the Roman letters are much more neat,
Mhm.
neatly executed, and much more professionally executed. And again, but still, again, you have in the runes and the vernacular, you have basically still the same formulary that you would expect on a Viking Age runestone,
Mhm.
right? So had this stone made over blah blah blah, and
Mhm.
who this person was. Whereas in the Latin part, it basically says almost the same, not exactly the same. But then they have a totally different formula. Obierunt, so they died. So this is also a very, very widespread kind of Latin formula in inscriptions, in Latin inscriptions. But this still, I mean, it was clearly important for them to still belong to two different cultural spheres to kind of convey that they are both anchored in a very, very old native local written tradition and in the absolutely newest thing that was coming at the time, right? So the Latin alphabet. So I think this has very much to do, probably less to do with the audience. So kind of they were addressing different audiences
Mhm.
because in that case they could have translated the whole thing in Latin, but they didn't. They used different kind of formulae. So I think this has less to do with the audience proficiency, and a lot to do with cultural reasons, kind of reasons pertaining to identity and these things.
Yeah, if I may suggest a weird parallel that crosses my mind is something sometimes maybe a little bit like the way that you see signs and advertising and labels in Canada in English and French.
Right, exactly.
Like it may say sort of roughly the same thing, but there's a cultural reason why we're including the French, or cultural
Mm,
reason why we're including the English, even if this is a community that uses one of the, like it's and something about the coexistence of the two says, immediately kind of says Canada. And I feel like sort of the coexistence of the Latin and the Norse and the coexistence of the scripts kind of immediately just says, you know, uh, medieval Scandinavian Christian
mm,
in a similar way.
mm.
I
No,
don't
so
know. It just,
that's a very good parallel. Yeah.
not quite right because there's not the same religious content to English and French in Canada, but I was just trying to think of, in the same way that the audience is um, kind of the same people, maybe.
Mm,
It just has different purposes for different ones. I don't know. I
mm,
just find this really fascinating because in a U.S. context, you don't it's hard to think of contemporary parallels to this, right? Except maybe in a couple religious communities where there might be a religious language that has some special significance.
Hmm.
Um, but even then, I feel like people are choosing one language or the other and not often putting both on there. I don't know. These are just fascinating artifacts to me.
I mean, of course, there are differences, and but the basic kind of cultural mechanisms are very, very similar. I would say, those that govern choice of script and language in the Middle Ages in these kind of inscriptions, and the signs in Canada, for example, that you were talking about, just extend this parallel and kind of going also to the argument that kind of the proficiency of the readers or even the writers doesn't matter
Yeah,
much sometimes. For example, Harald probably was not very proficient in Latin. But he chose to use Latin anyway for other reasons. I
right.
mean, if you think of, I mean, I'm Italian. I don't know how many times I go to Italian restaurants and there are misspellings in their menus, right? Nobody cares. Only I do,
Yeah,
right?
right.
Yeah, but
Sure.
nobody cares because the choice of Italian as a language it's not done because everybody who goes there knows Italian, but that's because it conveys some sort of stereotypes and certain cultural values. That's precisely the same thing.
That's the perfect analogy right there. Exactly. Yeah, because the Italian's not there for you. It's there for it's there for me who's sitting
Yeah,
down.
yeah.
Oh, like it's like
Absolutely. Or the Japanese, at the sushi restaurant. I can't read
yeah,
Japanese yet.
yeah, right.
And so that's why and that kind of what it led to in the Middle Ages is all sorts of corruptions of Latin texts in runes and these almost pseudo Latin texts.
Hmm.
There's one very good example that a colleague of mine has managed to crack. Is this inscription here. Now, unfortunately, I've already given you kind of the solution. So this is another lead amulet from Sweden,
Hmm.
and part in bold is the runes. And even if you're very good at Latin, I mean, you would not make any sense of this. This doesn't make any sense. I've taken a face value. But if you know a little bit on about how Latin was spelled in runes, and you know maybe the sources that this person may have used, then you can reconstruct kind of what kind of text was meant to be conveyed. So
Hmm.
this is not my suggestion. It's a Victor Franz by the PhD fellow that we have here in Oslo that proposed this solution, and I find it very, very convincing. But it's also I mean it's interesting from a textual point of view and so on and so forth, but also it's very interesting when as regards to what we were saying before, that someone could, write something that doesn't make any sense. And by the way, this was supposed to help the bearer.
Hmm.
So you can imagine you are, commissioning an amulet to be saved. And then the text that's on the amulet doesn't make any sense. You would think it's a problem, but it's actually not. Uh, right?
Like
So
like
clearly,
yeah, because I mean, well, I guess the intention is still there. Like even though
yes.
like yeah, if you did not have the solution below that, I would not have been able to figure out. I mean, yeah,
Mm.
I got Christie, okay, you know, um, incredible. Like,
Yeah.
and also I'm wondering, like, where do some of these spellings come from? Like the N for the two L's, like I guess I could maybe see that being from someone just really badly misreading a written text.
Could
But
be. It could be sometimes. It's really difficult to say, like in singular cases. But there are some examples where you, with a quite high degree of certainty, can say that people were probably copying from a Roman alphabet text, and they just misread it. And in addition, they didn't know what the Latin was supposed to be. And so we have a few cases, maybe the most obvious ones is where people must have overlooked abbreviation marks.
oh, sure, sure.
So, for example, you have DINI, Dini,
Mhm.
and they probably have missed the abbreviation mark for the word domini,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah, it makes perfect
Um,
sense. Yeah. And they
and
don't,
there's this phenomenon called minim confusion, where you have, in the Middle Ages, like the minims are, maybe it's already known to your audience, but like it's the short kind of strokes that form many letters, right? The N's,
sure.
the I's, the M's, the U's, and so on and so forth. And if you have um, a word like illuminate, and if the L's are mistaken as maybe are short or something, then you have a lot of vertical strokes. And
Right.
if you don't know what the word is supposed to be, and you're not very sure about, you don't know your Roman letters very well, good luck.
Yeah. Right. It's like, well, yeah, because if you don't know what the target is, yeah, exactly. You see Dini not knowing that the slash means, oh, it's Domini. And since you don't know
Yeah.
Latin anyway, you don't know it's not a word. So,
Mm, mm. But in other cases, you have signs of quite high competence. For example, this is another Swedish example. This is one of another amulet that's been folded several times,
hmm,
and it has a very long text. So this is only half of it that you can see here. So it's completely carved on the backside as well.
hmm,
And this was found in a sarcophagus in a church. And it was filled with debris because the lock was broken. And it is an amulet that kind of retells or recounts kind of one very famous Christian legend, that of the seven sleepers. Um, so which were seven young men. They kind of hid in a cave to escape from persecution for being Christians, around 250 AD, from some Roman emperor that I don't remember at this moment. So they hid in a cave, and the emperor thought, you know what, I'm gonna seal the cave, and then X hundred of years later, someone removed the stone from the entrance of the cave, and of course they came out alive and well. And they uh, only, I think the story goes that they discovered that like 300 years had passed, because they went to the market and tried to buy something with the coin from 300 years before, um, something like that.
isn't this a Robin Williams movie? This- yeah,
Um,
it's funny, all these stories, by the way, because I know I've talked about some of these things with our colleague Natalie Van Duzen at the University of Alberta, who's really interested in some of the transmission of these things in the Middle Ages. Just
yeah.
the stories that medieval Christians were just like they just loved, they just repeated endlessly that nobody knows anymore. Because they're not from the Bible, they're just these weird, organic growths that spread from place to place. And it's funny what these stories that nobody thinks about anymore that were so important to medieval Christians.
Absolutely. And here, I mean, there are some mistakes and some weird spellings. For example, um, in the names of the seven sleepers, you have here something that looks like Maximianus,
Hmm.
um, which was probably Maximianus. Uh, but otherwise, all in all, this is a quite complex and long Latin text we're reproducing on a really, really small piece of lead. So this is like hey big. So the runes
Wow.
are, 4 millimeters high, tall,
Wow. Yeah, that's
so
crazy.
half a centimeter tall maybe. And you have like four lines on the front side of
And
other lines on the back side.
and he doesn't have reading glasses. So I mean, like this is hard to do.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we need microscopes, of course, to read these things. And they surely didn't have microscopes. So,
Yeah.
so some of these people really display, quite a high degree of competence. And you have, as I said, some mistakes, but then again, some other, for example, Feely. in the genitive
Hmm.
form of Filius, so
Mhm.
of the of the son, right? The name of the son, name of the father, name of the son, and so on and so forth. Doubling of runes was really, really uncommon in the runic tradition, as maybe your audience already knows. So the long consonants were not doubled
Hmm.
at all, I think, in the Viking Age, and then it kind of grows as this tendency of double spelling long consonants. But doubling of vowels is really, really rare. You find it only in so you never find doubled long vowels in vernacular texts. You only find double vowels in Latin text, for example, in the word fili and in the genitive of some names. But you kind of have to know how the word is spelled in order to know that you have to have two eyes there at the end.
Mhm.
So they have to know the spelling norm, and kind of it's not enough to know how the word is pronounced.
Right. I mean, I respect the attentiveness that underlies that, because it is attentive, right? This is someone who doesn't look like the surest hand in Latin, but when you consider uh, that kind of attentive detail plus how small this work
Mm.
is, you know, the errors kind of they seem really minimal in the face of
Mm.
the actual achievement there.
Actually, some of these amulets, the longer ones, there are some examples that I don't have here from Denmark, which are really, really long and complex and really good Latin. Some colleagues have, suggested that it was actually the priests
Hmm.
who were in charge of carving them, or at least giving a very good, original from which to copy. Because
Mhm.
the Latin is so good that someone must have had a schooling in Latin, like a formal sort of schooling in Latin,
Mhm.
because otherwise it's really difficult to you can't write that kind of long text correctly by just hearing Latin in a way. So they must have had some sort of formal schooling. Some of the people.
Right, at least one of the middlemen in producing this. I suppose it's also something that we have to keep in mind is that we look at something like this and we don't necessarily know how many people stood behind that.
Yeah, of course.
That's, right, that's not necessarily one person's work, but maybe different people doing different things,
Absolutely.
dictating
No, it's very
versus
difficult. Very difficult to know.
yeah.
With amulets and probably even more with monumental inscriptions,
Mhm.
where they must have shared the workload to some degree.
Right. Who's the carver, who's the originator of whatever is going to be said, who edits it, who decides this is fit for publication, as it were.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Revere too.
And that's something that's important to keep in mind, I guess, with all of these inscriptions. Is I just think our image, probably influenced by the very dramatized, mystified way we often talk about runes. It's like the lone rune carver sitting there
Mm.
and making this, but very often there's probably a commissioner and maybe a person who produces it first on wood or something like that. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, and I think especially in public inscriptions, monumental inscriptions, so texts that are meant to be read by many people for a very, very long time, and we still read them. And especially maybe with funerary monuments,
Mhm.
someone, the text that someone left after he or she was dead, like would represent them for forever. So I
Yes.
think it was incredibly important um, that they got it right
Mhm.
in a way. And so the role of the commissioner was surely it must have been high
Mhm.
in maybe composing the text and producing, as you said, an original or like from which a carver could copy, and then inscribe it in practice. But we don't know,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
I suspect you're right. It would. I'm just thinking here, idly, just how fascinating it would be to go to be a fly on the wall from the first to the last step of how something like that gets made. Right.
that would have been I would like that.
Can, so we've taken more than an hour of your time, and I want to be aware of it. So let us know when you're done. There are a few questions that have come up in the chat. Can I
Sure.
share some of these with you?
Absolutely.
Johann Petzer asked, would writers Latinize their names typically? So like Olaver to Olaus, or we saw Haraldur to Haraldus.
Some of them, yes. So so names of like holy names are always in Latin.
Mhm.
Um, Names of inscribers, for example, sometimes we see that they Latinate them to different degrees. For example, Harald, uh, who actually he signs like as Harald in some other inscriptions, and then in the one that I've shown you before, he signs like he uses a Latinate form of his name. Um, in some other examples, you like kind of what we said before, you see attempts to Latinization of names, or that we think may be attempts to Latinization of names. For
Hmm.
example, this is a small, very small piece of bone from Sweden, and it just says Andrus, and then ris is probably ristis or
Mhm.
carved. Um, but Andrus is more problematic because it could be some sort of some form of the name Andreas or Anders or Arnor,
Mhm.
but there is no attested Latinized form of these names that looks like Andrus. And so one possibility is that this person tried to Latinize his name
Mhm.
in a way that, sounded Latin to him. Let's add us at the end.
Right.
Good enough. Right. So again, like to what degree is proficiency important? To what degree is it important, like how people perceived what you wrote?
I see what you mean, and that's such an interesting example because yeah, you don't know what's going through the writer's name. Is that some local variation, or is that Anders trying to think like, well, I don't know what this comes from, but here's I'll just add oos to it and see if that works.
And the problem is that we don't, most of the times we don't have enough context
Yeah.
to say anything more about that than what I've said just now. When it comes to this little piece of bone, it was actually part of an archaeological excavation where they found a lot of high status objects,
Hmm.
really, really high status objects, and the findings that kind of suggested a almost an aristocratic milieu.
Hmm.
Um, and so this is speculation, of course. It's kind of tempting to connect the two things. So an aristocratic milieu with these, imported items from maybe continental, from France, for example, these really unique items, really high status objects, and then someone trying to Latinize their name.
Yeah. I
This is, as I said, it's speculation. It's kind of tempting,
but
and
it's fun. I mean, I think it's always a useful mental exercise to say like what's the milieu in which something like this gets produced.
hmm.
One of the funniest things about it is that if the name is Latinized, it still looks like it's part of a Norse inscription, right? Because Reese,
Yeah.
um,
Mm.
so it's almost as if like I were trying to show off and look fancier, and on my headstone, I demanded that instead of Jackson Wade Crawford, it was like Jacques LaWade Crawford or something.
Mm.
Like just sort of fake France it.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's another really fascinating item you've got there. Blake wanted to ask, most of the examples of Latin and runes are from what time periods?
So the Scandinavian Middle Ages. So let's say from between the 12th century, so 1100s, throughout the Middle Ages, wherever there was still a genuine kind of active runic tradition, because the runic tradition kind of died out at different points in time in different geographical regions. But for example, if from Norway, from the city of Bergen, where we have hundreds and hundreds of medieval runic inscriptions, you still have runic Latin, in the 1400s. as you do in on Gotland, for example.
Hmm.
So it's really that span. You don't find. I think there is one kind of late Viking Age inscription that has a small part in Latin. But now I don't want to lie, so because I don't remember exactly, but I think that it could be like Ave Maria in an inscription. But the
Interesting.
dating, it's a stone, right? So it's really difficult to date to begin with.
Hmm.
So it could be someone, from the 1100s, kind of reproducing the style of the Viking Age, for
Sure.
example, using Latin because it fit in the textual tradition of the 1100s, for example. But yeah, that's kind of the time frame.
And Johann Peter was w looking back at the inscription we paused on for a while at the beginning, the Hic Jacet Torgillus,
Yeah.
observing since nasals aren't normally written before stops in runes or homorganic stops, so the special nasal consonant rune is just for a non-Norse text, just to like, does it signal like here's where an N goes? Because
Mm,
if I take his question right, is that what that's signaling? Because in a vernacular text, they know where to put the N that's been cut
mm.
out, but here they don't. So is it like
Yeah.
just drawing attention to that N? Or do you think it's
Um,
pronounced differently? Do you think that's
no, so
representing?
it's used. So no, I think it was pronounced differently.
Okay.
Because you have both. You're talking about the N rune, right?
Yeah, that ventris
Yeah.
at the bottom left.
Right, but it's also used in
Oh, okay, yeah.
Munder,
Hmm.
Gunmundar.
Mhm.
Right, so you have it here because probably because it was a long N, and here because it was before dental consonant, so before D in
Hmm.
this case, like in ventris, it was before T. But so this is a vernacular word where the dotted N is used, and
Hmm.
you have this contrast between the dotted and undotted, so regular N rune, also
Let's see.
in the Old Norse or in the Old Swedish text, right? So you have the gun here with the dotted N,
Uh-huh.
and then you have lesin with the regular N. So it was
I see.
yeah.
Interesting. Yeah,
Mm,
because there it's just yeah, it's word final after a vowel or it's intervocalic, but then
mm,
the dotted one, yeah, either long or preceding a dental consonant. That's interesting.
mm,
Huh. Okay, so that's probably reflecting different pronunciations in both languages, maybe a vernacular inspired pronunciation of the Latin N before the T. That's very, very interesting.
yeah, maybe. Of course, we don't know, but it could be that. I mean, I would say since it's again orthophonic, all of it, so it kind of reflects the pronunciation, both the Latin one and the vernacular one. I would say that probably pronunciation was very similar between the two.
Sure. Sure.
And another kind of, if I may, another kind of interesting detail, thinking about kind of the connection between the runic tradition and the manuscript tradition, is that the the N in this position, so when it's long or when it precedes a dental consonant, so D or T, um, in some Danish manuscripts, medieval manuscripts, you actually have the N with a stroke, like the through the N.
Huh.
So you have the N and then with a stroke, with a horizontal stroke, exactly in the same positions.
Interesting.
Um, and then there's a colleague of mine from Stockholm, Magnus Källström, who has kind of highlighted this detail here. And we don't know exactly in what direction this went, so from the runic to the lat to the manuscript, or vice versa. But some connection, there must be some connection, because this practice is so uncommon, both in the manuscript tradition and in the runic tradition, that there must be some connection between them.
Yes, something is being signaled there. That's really interesting.
Mm.
And it, huh, yeah, and I suppose it could be as simple as nasal plus dental, with the dental being potentially just another N. Sounds different one way or another. It's I don't know. That's really interesting. Is it devoiced or something? Um, but that doesn't make much sense with a D behind
There are
it.
a few theories, and kind of the two different ones, the main ones at least, is that some people mean that or think that this is a quantity thing. So they are signaling kind of that the N is long.
Mhm.
And some other people hypothesize that this kind of highlights changing the quality of the pronunciation, so that it was pronounced differently. It was not only long, but it had some sort of different quality to it.
Yeah,
So sort of
it's an interesting question. That's very.
pronounced a little bit differently. Yeah.
Um, and Monty wanted to ask, did the church approve of the usage of runes? Did they have associations with paganism?
That's a really good question. Um, well, all these monuments were placed in churches or outside churches.
Mhm.
These amulets were placed in the coffins of Christian people that were buried Christians. So in this period of time, so now we are at the end of the 13th century, people were Christianized. And so there was no, from what we can see, there was no connection between runes and heathen times, let's say,
Mhm.
or non-Christian times. Because all of these examples that I've shown you are from clerical milieux, uh, monasteries, parish churches. Even as I said, I mean, these amulets with runes, some of them may have even been carved by priests.
Right.
Um, and there is nothing really. I mean, of course, when you go into the realm of amulets and magic, probably kind of the practice of magic was probably frowned upon by the institutional church, but not the use of runes per se, because you have amulets within the Roman alphabet as well, saying very similar things. Um,
Yeah, and I think this is actually a big misconception that a lot of people have about the history of runes, that the church sort of suppressed them as a pagan associated thing. When it seems to me that that's the huge evidence of the Nordic Middle Ages weighs against that, given just how many runestones inscriptions there are, and then these runic Latin texts that are very Christian in context. It,
Absolutely, absolutely. Mm.
I wonder if I wonder what you think of a characterization like this, that the Catholic Church was traditionally pretty adaptable in how it would reach people in new cultures, and willing to adapt the tools of that culture to reach that culture, and the runes are
Mm.
just a tool for reaching people who have that as a written alphabet. And they might uh they're not going to adapt it to writing in manuscript, except in some very weird marginal places, because they've got their own tradition for doing that. But it's like, oh, you carve on stone with this alphabet, yeah, sure, whatever, do that. you know uh it doesn't seem like.
Absolutely. Yeah. Of course, manuscripts in the Latin alphabet must have had a tremendous, I mean, a very important role in the spread of the church as an institution and of Christianity. But so if we go back a few hundred years to the early Viking Age, or like to the Viking Age, I mean, Christianization of Scandinavia already started in some parts of Scandinavia, probably, at the beginning of the 10th century.
Mhm.
We have the first Christian burials and so on and so forth. And basically all of the, I don't know, 3,000 late Viking Age runestones. So we're now talking 250 to 300 years before this. So all of these runestones are Christian monuments, many of them overtly Christian, having Christian prayers on them, although they were not in Latin yet, like here, Ave Maria or Pater Noster in other instances, but there were, invocations to God and Mary and so on, and Saint Michael and so on and so forth. So they had huge crosses on them. So already back then in the Viking Age, runes were not associated. They cannot have been frowned upon by the missionaries or the church of the time,
Mhm.
because the people that had the power and were baptized were raising runic monuments, runestones with long runic inscriptions saying that they were Christians.
Mhm.
And so already back then, the connection to to a heathen world must have been very feeble from the evidence that we have. So that maybe there were, a ton of small, wooden inscriptions that we don't have anymore. But from the evidence that we have thousands of runic monuments which were overtly Christian. That's a pretty clear indication.
Yeah, and it just strikes me as like, even if you think, and I don't know that any medieval missionaries would think this way, like, well, we have the better alphabet that we're bringing into you. It's like, well, still, if there's already an alphabet on the ground that people know, just let them. The Roman alphabet was used by pagans first too, right? Um,
Yeah, yeah.
so it's not
No,
as if,
and it was much more economic to just, continue writing in the alphabet that they knew. I mean,
yeah,
also in a sense that if you think that these were public displays of Christianity, right?
hmm,
So let's say that I'm a chieftain, powerful person in some region of Viking Age Sweden, and I'm showing everybody that I am Christian by erecting this runic monument. If the inscription that I produce is in an alphabet that nobody can read,
yeah,
because back then the literacy in the Roman alphabet must have been close to zero. I mean, must have been zero in the regular population. It makes much more sense to inscribe what I have to say in an alphabet that reaches a very wide audience, at least to the extent that the audience was literate at all. Of course, that's another can of worms,
sure. But
but there
that's
were surely
absolutely,
more people that were literate in runes than in Roman alphabet.
hmm, right, a small percentage rather than no percentage.
Mm,
Still, it's what reaches people. I
yeah.
I think it's fascinating, and I think these inscriptions you've shown us are just really interesting monuments of a time that is, in transition from one world to another, and
Mm,
and just so in the middle of that transition, that it's fascinating to look at. Um,
absolutely.
but I've really appreciated your time. I think we should probably cut pretty soon before we're asking too much of you. Any last minute thoughts, remarks you want to make?
No, just thank you for the invitation. It was a very nice chat and nice talking about a topic that I find very very fascinating.
Well, I do too, and thank you so much for showing those examples and kind of guiding us through them. I think that was that was very valuable. Um,
Absolutely. Thank you.
yeah. Well, appreciate your time. Appreciate everyone on Patreon who came and submitted questions and such. And well, for now, everybody, I wish you all the best from beautiful Colorado.